single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making it another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Chantal Destra. There is just about 1 week until the state budget deadline, and while negotiations are underway between the executive and legislative chambers, the likelihood of meeting the April 1st budget deadline is minimal. The speculation over whether or not the final budget will include increased taxes on wealthy New Yorkers is still ongoing at the state capitol. As we've discussed on the show, both chambers of the legislature included the policy in their respective one-house budget resolutions. However, Governor Kathy Hochul has been consistent in not wanting to move forward with this measure. This week, we sat down with State Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins for an in-depth discussion around the Senate's one-house budget resolution, the push for increased taxes on wealthy New Yorkers, and the negotiation process for the budget. Here's that conversation. Thank you so much for joining us back on the show today, Leader.
It's always good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, the Senate's one-house budget resolution included increased taxes for wealthy New Yorkers. I know that this is something that the chamber has included in its resolutions year after year. Meanwhile, Governor Kathy Hochul has stated that she's not interested in increasing taxes on wealthy New Yorkers. So how far is the chamber going to go to push the governor to include it in the final enacted budget?
Well, as you know, we do put it in our one house because in our one house, we talk about our priorities. And as you said, we are trying to meet those priorities, and we've got to obviously generate revenue. And so in our one house, we continue to ask those who are the wealthiest among us to do just a little bit more, you know, in order to accommodate for what's happening on a federal level, with the variety of cuts that are happening in the hospital spaces, health spaces, education, you name it, food insecurity. So we are looking at the environment, looking at where we are now and where we need to be in terms of making sure that New Yorkers have what they need. So yes, we do ask for those who can give a little more, do a little more. We're trying to expand childcare. We're trying to help childcare workers. We know that there's a number of people who we know are hungry, and we've had to invest more now in food banks, et cetera. So there are just so many needs that we're trying to make sure we meet on the education space, health space, you name it, and we're trying to meet it.
Do you think that there's a way to compromise and meet in the middle between what your chamber wants and what the governor wants on this issue?
Well, just so your viewers understand the process, the governor presents, her bill, her list of things she wants for her budget, and then each house then puts forward our priorities in the one houses. So we just completed that one house process. We've voted on it, and so now we're negotiating in earnest the priorities that each of us really are pushing. So there's always a negotiation. There's always a conversation about how best to meet the needs. But the conversation this year, as you have heard over and over again, is affordability. And we're trying to figure out how to keep more money in working New Yorkers' pockets, as well as try and meet the needs that we know people have. So that's what the negotiation is going to be about. And ultimately, our budget deadline is April 1st, and we are going to be moving to hopefully meet that deadline.
And what do you say to the concerns that increased taxes on wealthy New Yorkers will drive out migration?
Well, I think that, again, New Yorkers, I feel, are a very, very special breed of people. We know, I want to believe that we're in the greatest state in this great country because we understand what's important. We invest in our people, we invest in education, we invest in healthcare, we invest in environment, and we invest in housing. We are doing the kinds of things that people expect us to do. We're trying to provide opportunities for our children, not only in education, but whether it's after-school programs, there are so many things that we as New Yorkers are expected to do in order to continue to lead, but also to maintain what we know are important things. So, you know, we've gotten, frankly, more millionaires over the past few years, and again, we certainly want everyone to stay. And in an environment that is so threatening in so many ways, I think we can come together and fund the priorities that we know is important to everyone and get the work done. So I don't believe people are going to leave. I don't want them to leave. As I said, we're not talking about, we're talking about, 0.5% more on some of the wealthiest people and the wealthiest corporations, which will go a long way to make sure people are able to have health care and food and education, child care, and things that we know are important.
And the Chamber's One House resolution also included measures to help New Yorkers with the high cost of utility rates by way of different programs like the heat pump rebate program, as well as different assistance and affordability measures. So can you tell us how big of an issue this is in the state and why this was important for your conference to include?
Well, it's huge. And as a conference, we have, since the beginning of the year, been pushing different pieces of legislation. We've put together packages to really address the costs that people are really feeling around utilities and trying to get a handle, whether it's transparency, whether it's more accountability, whether it's making sure that there's just not a lot of miscellaneous interests that are being put into these utility bills, more understanding, of delivery charges that somehow, exceed exponentially the actual charge of the actual cost of the electricity or the gas that you're getting. There's so much that we can do. We're also, in our One House budget, trying to help consumers navigate the process and have some assistance in really fighting electric bills that they can't quite understand. So there is so much to be done, and it is extremely important. There's not a time, frankly, that I go back into the community that somebody isn't saying to me, can you help me with these Con Edison bills? People, we have Con Edison, but I'm sure all over the state, no matter who your carrier is, people are really crying out for help. So in our One House, we've endeavored to start trying to get at the root of it, whether it's the Public Service Commission, really examining these rate cases a bit more, really making sure that we're not just making sure shareholders are doing great and constituents are suffering. If the company is making this much money, let's get it back into people's pockets and let's lower these rates. So we are trying to really push in that way, as is the Assembly. The governor, we all understand that utilities really are among the highest that it's ever been, and it's really on top of mind for New Yorkers.
And we know the budget has been delayed or late in the past few years, and the Assembly has been pretty infamous for not wanting to include policy in the budget. Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie has said time and time again, policy is what makes the budget delayed. So I was curious, do you think your conference will ever take up the position to not include policy in the budget moving forward to sort of speed up the negotiation process?
Well, I don't know that that's the case, and generally the governor doesn't feel that way. The governor puts policies. Every governor that I've worked with has put policy in the budget. So, we're dealing with policy in the budget one way or the other. And for us, we have things that we'd like to see done as well. So we put it in our One House bill and we negotiate around that. It's not our policies, frankly, that have ever delayed the budget. Yes, it would be nice if we're only talking about finances, but the reality is that there's always policy there. We've got to negotiate, we've got to figure it out, and we've got to get a budget. And somehow we always do.
And from your purview, how can the budget process and negotiation process be improved and improve transparency in the years to come?
It's something that I wish I had a good answer to. There are 213 members in the legislature and one governor. And I've got to figure out how to get the majority of 63 votes, and the speaker has to figure out how to get the majority of 150 votes. And for me, in my conference, we have work groups around all of the areas of interest so that people have input into what kinds of things they would like to have, us fight for in the budget. A lot of negotiation is done with staff, and it's a lot of back and forth with members in order to at least have people involved. We also have presentations, at least for our members, so that they understand what's going on in other areas of interest. The committee meetings are open, obviously, but in terms of people really getting to see every piece of how the quote unquote the sausage is made, I don't know how to make that easier. But I will say that the representatives, the folks who are in conference in the Senate, do have a good understanding of all the pieces of the budget, because we try and make people aware. And so that when they're voting from a knowledge base that is comprehensive, not just their little area, but the entirety. Now, there's people, obviously, if you're interested in agriculture, that's where your focus is. If you're interested in, if you're the chair of this committee, that's where your focus has to be. But you're also going to be aware of what else is happening. So I've really endeavored to make it a more inclusive body, so that although people say there's used to be 3 men in the room, but now there's 2 women and 1 man. But the reality is that, yes, ultimately 3 people, sign off, but for Speaker Hastie and for myself, that sign off comes with the buy-in of the vast majority of our bodies, based on information, based on knowledge, based on need.
And would you say that level of transparency is consistent when messages of necessities are being used to pass the budget? I know that there's been a lot of conversation to try to not do messages of necessities, especially when the budget is late. Do you have any perspective on that?
Again, we do endeavor to get an on-time budget, and I think everybody's better off when the information is in the public view longer. We usually look for at least being out 3 days. And so that is really the optimum, and I don't think any of us like messages of necessity. But sometimes they are necessary, which is why they're called messages of necessity. But I think for all of us, we would rather a process that allows for the legislation, the budget, whatever it is, to be in the public eye for the requisite at least 3 days, so that people have an idea of what's in it and they'll be able to comment on it, etc. So we try and use it very, very, infrequently.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Leader. I'm so happy that we were able to have this in-depth conversation.
Well, I really, really appreciate the conversation. Thanks so much.
And we were speaking with State Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins. And for an extended interview with the Majority Leader, where we discuss immigration and climate policies in the state, you can visit our website. That's at nynow.org. In this next segment, we'll sit down with State Senator Brian Kavanaugh, who chairs the Senate Committee on Housing, Construction, and Community Development. We unpack the senator's 20-year tenure in the legislature as he prepares to leave at the end of this term. Here's that conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Senator.
It's great to be here.
Of course. Now, after 2 decades serving in the state legislature, you've ultimately decided to take a step away and not run for re-election. I imagine that must have been a very difficult decision to make. So what can you tell us about the process of deciding ultimately to take a step back?
Yeah, I always thought elected officials make a mistake if they get on autopilot. There are a lot of people, I think it's like, every 2 years they say to themselves, okay, it's time to run for re-election. And I always thought, that should be a conscious decision. It should be a thoughtful decision about whether this is the best way to serve. And obviously, I've made the decision to continue to serve many times so far. But this year, I thought a lot about it, and I decided that after 20 years, I've accomplished a lot of the things I set out to accomplish. There are many other opportunities to serve the public, which I intend to do. And I just decided it's a good time and it's a good opportunity to allow other people to step up and present themselves as candidates and take the seat and do the work.
Yeah, you mentioned in your statement that it was time for a new generation of leadership. So I'm curious, what does that mean to you, and how are you hoping this new generation will approach legislating?
Yeah, I said that in my campaign 2 decades ago, that I was presenting myself as a new generation of leadership, somebody who's ready to step in with new ideas and new energy. And I really believe that. I believed it then, and I believe it now. I still have a lot of energy for this job. I still love this job. I think I'm still being very productive in this job, but at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that change is good, and that giving people the opportunity to make their case to the voters and then bring their ideas to the job is, it's a good, healthy thing in a democracy. And there are, I've actually, at the time I left, announced I wasn't going to run for election. I hadn't endorsed a candidate. I've now endorsed a candidate for my own seat. But, there'll be a new housing chair, which I've been working on for a long time. And, new people sort of pitching their perspective on what needs to be done. And I think that, I think New York State is in a good place right now. And I'm optimistic about the future.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, you serve as the chair of the Senate's Housing, Construction, and Community Development Committee. You've been influential in pushing forward the legislature's different housing priorities, such as good cause eviction, the Housing Access Voucher Program, and even the COVID eviction moratorium. So can you tell us about your strategy in getting these different priorities over the finish line?
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a few of the greatest hits. I worked on housing for most of my professional life, in my years in the Assembly and before the Democrats took the majority in the Senate. It was always an important issue, and we worked very hard to sort of do what we could. But I think the big change came in 2019 when the Democrats took the majority in the Senate, and were able to sort of, I think, about the whole system and kind of craft solutions that really are comprehensive. So we've done an enormous amount to protect tenants. That includes strengthening the rent stabilization laws in New York, but also strengthening protections against evictions in the rest of the state. Good cause eviction gives localities the opportunity to adopt a set of protections for tenants if they choose to do that. At the same time, we spent a lot of time protecting homeowners who might be facing foreclosure from taxes or from mortgages. We have an enormous program called the Homeowner Protection Program that provides guidance and resources when people might be struggling to keep their homes. So protecting people where they are has been a big part of that. You mentioned, during COVID, we did a $4 billion rental assistance program. We've now followed that up with, just this past year, we passed a bill called the Housing Access Voucher Program that I introduced in the first weeks of 2020 before we realized that COVID would consume a lot of our attention, and that got enacted last year, and we're looking to fund that. But that stands for the idea that you can't, if you're facing eviction because you can't pay your rent, having a lawyer and having rights in court doesn't help that much if, you're going to get evicted because the rent is overdue. So providing people resources when they're facing that situation, providing resources to stabilize people in their homes. Our program is modeled on a program called Federal Section 8, which is, it's a voucher that helps people cover the rent. And we've also worked a lot on increasing housing production through very large capital investments. We've very greatly increased those in my time in the state Senate. Much more money to maintain the housing we've got, to build new housing. So I think that you're going to see those investments paying off in the next couple of years. It takes a few years to actually build. And then I think the last big thing is we need to ensure that we're getting regulatory barriers out of the way of building more housing. We need to build more housing more rapidly. We need to build it in places where there's a lot of demand, and much of the state is really short on housing. And so this year we're talking about reforming some of the environmental laws that have been sometimes unnecessary obstacles. My colleague, Senator Rachel May, and the governor have proposals on that, and I'm hoping that's something we can get done. New York City has taken a big step in recent years, something called the City of Yes, to expand production. But I think that's something that we're going to have to continue to work on this year, and hopefully my successors will continue to push as well.
And you also sponsored the All Electric Buildings Act, which would essentially establish the state energy construction code to sort of eliminate the use of fossil fuels in new construction back in 2023. So at the time, what were you hoping the impact of that legislation would be, and how has it sort of come together in the years that it's been passed?
It's a big part of our broader effort to implement the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which we passed in 2019, again, the first year that Democrats had majorities in both houses. And that is really a truly ambitious law to try to make sure that we are partly, it's about doing our part to make sure that we're not destroying the planet through climate change, but it's also about making sure that we have clean, affordable energy, that we're not kind of polluting our communities unnecessarily. And the All Electric Building Act is a big part of that. The first step is to stop building new structures that require dirty fuels, that require gas and oil to be burnt on the property. And so All Electric Building Act basically requires for smaller buildings first, and then for larger buildings as well. And it is currently being litigated. The oil and gas industry is fighting it very aggressively in court. I do expect that it will be upheld, and will go. It was first phase that was supposed to go into effect this past January 1st, but there was an agreement to delay that until the courts have the opportunity to do their work. But I do expect that that'll go into effect, and that'll have a huge impact in basically making sure people have cleaner, more affordable homes over the long run, because we know that clean energy is much cheaper at this point than burning oil or gas.
And during your time in the legislature, you also focused on election reform. So how are you hoping that the state will approach strengthening democracy in the years to come?
We've had a very strong run in recent years on election reform. My colleague, Zellner Myrie, who is chairing the election law committee, for a long time used to like to say we went from worst to first in terms of the quality of our election laws. When I was in the Assembly as a Democrat, I worked a lot with, the folks in charge. We had Republicans in the Senate, and we did some good work to sort of make sure the system was fair and, cleaner and more voter friendly. But the big change came again starting in 2019 when we instituted early voting and other reforms that really were intended to make sure that everybody has access to vote, making sure that the votes are counted properly. So I think we're in pretty good shape in terms of our laws. We also have much stronger campaign finance laws than we had then. We closed some loopholes. There used to be a loophole that allowed, say, a large company that controls dozens of LLCs, these smaller companies, could have each of them make a separate contribution, and they didn't count toward the overall limit. So, a few people could get together and give hundreds of thousands of dollars to a politician under the law. So we closed that loophole. We have public financing of elections now that allow the system to be fairer to people and allow everybody to compete, and also allow individual New Yorkers who make small contributions to have a bigger impact. So I think we're in pretty good shape. I think we always have to be vigilant and keep focusing on making sure the laws are working for the voters, which of course is the most important part.
You've done a lot in your career. Are there any legislative priorities that you may not have had the time or the bandwidth to focus on that you wish you could have, and you wish the legislature will pick up the mantle on those priorities heading into the next few years?
Yeah, I think some of them are within the spaces I've talked about. On housing, I think we've done a great deal of really good work over the last few years to address the housing crisis, the homelessness crisis, the eviction crisis, but we know that those are still with us, and I think that those things would be quite a bit worse had we not done the work we've done in recent years, but there's obviously a lot more work to be done. In particular, I mentioned it earlier, but just to highlight it, there are many communities in our state where the rate at which tenants are evicted exceeds 10%, where in a given year, 1/10 of all tenants will be evicted. We know evictions are very destructive for people. We know they cause negative health effects. We know they cause bad educational outcomes for students. And yet, sometimes when a very small amount of money is is at stake. We don't really have the system to put in place to make sure that we keep people in their homes and keep them stable. So they end up living in a hotel that, incidentally, the government is often picking up the cost of anyway. So I've worked hard on that issue. We have a program called the Shelter Arrears Eviction Forestallment Program, which is intended to make those emergency payments. Many of our counties have picked that program up and done it well, but that's something that still needs work. And again, I think across everybody understands that housing affordability and other affordability issues are still, really causing a lot of burdens for people. So that's something that I think will be an ongoing effort. And I think, again, I think I've done my part over the years, but there's still a lot more work to be done.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
No, it's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And we were speaking with State Senator Brian Kavanaugh, representing the 27th State Senate District in Manhattan. And for more on that, you can visit our website at nynow.org. You can also check out our newsletter for exclusive content, including this week's Q&A with Assemblymember Farah Soufran Forrest. You can subscribe by going to newsletter.nynow.org or by scanning the QR code on your screen. Well, that does it for this edition of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET,